Hey everybody, and welcome to the FLATLINING Podcast from Fulcrum Strategies. I'm Matthew Handley, and with me is our president and CEO, Ron Howrigon. Last week we put out our interview with Wendell Potter about Medicare for All. It was a very good conversation about Medicare for All, and I encourage everyone to check it out if they haven't already. You can find it at flatlining.net or wherever you're listening to this podcast today. Back from our little bit of our summer holiday, we've had some breaking news come over the last couple of weeks with a number of Supreme Court decisions, and we're going to talk about one of them today and how that Supreme Court decision affects healthcare, and in particular the No Surprises Act. And that would be the Chevron case. And there's a lot of the overturning of the Chevron case, I guess, rather. There's been a lot of talk in the healthcare world about how this is going to magically force the government to start obeying the No Surprises Act, with Secretary Becerra not enforcing certain aspects of the law. Unfortunately, we're going to throw a little bit of cold water on that fire today as we talk about it with some reality here on the FLATLINING Podcast. So, Ron, let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about what the Chevron case was and what it changed about how laws are enforced here in the United States.
Yeah, and at the risk of being a little bit wonky, and I'll try to keep this out of the, too much of that and get into what it means from a real perspective. The Chevron case was actually the most cited case in appellate courts and other decisions of any case ever. And it really sort of got to one of the fundamental sort of constitutional pieces, which is who has authority, what is the division of power, that kind of stuff. So what Chevron did all the way back, and it was done in 1984, is it said basically when there is a conflict between what is written in law, something Congress passed was signed by the president, and what is in a regulation, either by an agency or like a scientific interpretation of the law, that deference had to be given by the courts and given priority to the agency's regulations. So we all know that laws aren't perfect. They don't give every single example or how to implement the laws. And so regulatory agencies, the FDA, et cetera, HHS, come out with rules. And they say, okay, this is our interpretation of law. This is what this means. And what Chevron said is, if there's a dispute between those two and it goes to court, the court has to give deference to the regulatory agency. They are, in essence, presumed right until proven wrong, so to speak. Okay, when the Supreme Court overturned that, they didn't flip it and say, well, we assume the law is correct. They said no deference should be given, and each individual court must decide what the spirit, intent, and the writing of the law is, and then interpret it themselves. Okay, that gets rid of 40 years worth of precedent, gets rid of a bunch of things that have been founded on, and it will create, at least for some period of time, a fair amount of chaos. And it will create it through a bunch of industries, but healthcare will have a number of things that will probably pop up and immediately challenge now that no deference has to be given to either the FDA or HHS or CMS, et cetera. And maybe now would be a good time to sort of go into some of what we think will come out as a challenge to that and how fundamental some of this stuff could be.
Sure. Let's do that. Let's exclude TMA first and the No Surprises Act. Let's talk about some of the other ones first, where this will have an effect.
Yeah. So some of the things that people think will hit challenges, recent things. For example, the FDA's approval of one of the over-the-counter medications for abortion. Well, does the FDA have methylcrystal? Does the FDA have the authority to do that? That's not written in law. So that'll probably be challenged. One of the things that's going to be challenged, and this will be interesting, is does CMS have the right or the ability to change reimbursement when they do their cuts every year? Where is that written in law? And if it's not written in law, where does CMS gain the authority to do that? That'll be challenged. I mean, that's fundamental in how Medicare decides how much physicians are going to be paid. That will be interesting to see. There will be a number of these cases around, what is CDC? What are they able to do? What is the FDA able to do? What's HHS, CMS? One of the things we know is going to be challenged is the whole Biden negotiating drug prices. Well, one of the things the drug companies are going to say is, show me where that's written in the law that you have the authority and ability to do that. Now, it doesn't mean that all of these things will immediately be overturned. It means it opens up a new look by the courts. The other thing that this will create is because it talks about individual courts. What happens if one circuit court, and I'll pick the abortion issue, the FDA issue there. What if one circuit court says, no, I don't think they have the right to do that. They can't do that. And another circuit court said, yeah, I think they have the right to do that. I think that's what the spirit and the intent of the law was. We could have what is in essence federal law with conflicting circuit court rulings, which I think until they are decided eventually at the Supreme Court level, if the Supreme Court takes it up, you could have a scenario where federal law is implemented differently based on the geographic jurisdiction of circuit courts. Well, okay, what if that happened with the Medicare reimbursement? What if next year Medicare cuts again and Circuit Court A says, nope, can't do it. And so for those states that are covered by that circuit court, payment stays the same, but Circuit Court B says, oh, yeah, you can do it. Absolutely. And so it gets cut somewhere else. This is going to create an environment that, that we really haven't seen for a while. And it's going to take quite a while for the dust to settle on all of these things.
And it assumes as well that all these things are going to be brought to litigation, which, as litigious as a society as we are, I have no doubt that a lot of it will be.
It assumes they're going to be brought to litigation, which we think they will be. And then you've got to also think about all the various steps that litigation could go. So Circuit Court A rules one way. Whoever loses that case files for a stay in appeal with Supreme Court or an appellate court. Okay, they get a stay. Now the appellate court rules. Whoever loses that doesn't like it. They file for a stay to get Supreme Court. I mean, we could take some of these issues like CMS or the FDA or whatever, and it could be years before this finally gets resolved by going all the way to the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about what I've seen the most about in the healthcare world this past week or so since this case came out is the No Surprises Act. And of course, this was one where, and we've talked about it at length on this program before, where the Texas Medical Association sued the Biden administration to have the law properly implemented. It so far has not been, and it appears that Judge Kernodle has kind of said, I've done all I can do in my courtroom. How is overturning the Chevron case going to affect, or will it affect, the No Surprises Act?
So I think it will affect in a small way. And let me explain what I mean by that. So TMA3, which is of the 4 rulings, and Texas Medical Association is 4-0. I mean, they won every single one of them. But TMA3 was the one that was most critical because it had to do with the appropriate administration of the qualifying payment amount, of the IDR process, of transparency, all of that stuff that really was at the core of some of the objections. Judge Kernodle ruled on that, said the government was wrong, told them that they needed to fix it. The government has appealed TMA3. So how I think Chevron is going to impact the No Surprises Act and TMA3 is it will make it very difficult, if not impossible, for the government to win an appeal. Because part of what they were appealing on was Chevron, was saying, no, the judge is wrong. Deference should have been given to HHS. We have the responsibility of interpreting this law, which is what we did. And it was really what their defense was in TMA3. Well, that underpinning for the appeal is gone now. Okay. Now they can't say, well, they should give deference to us because they got a Supreme Court ruling saying, no, they shouldn't. And they've got a Supreme Court really ruling backing Kernodle and saying each individual court will interpret the law, which is what he did. Now, I don't think they needed that to win on appeal because what Chevron was sort of saying is when it's ambiguous or when it's not clear or when it's not spelled out, what the judge said in his ruling was this is not at all unclear. It's very clear. The law was extremely explicit in spelling these things out. So his ruling wasn't you don't have the right to interpret. It was, you're interpreting it completely wrong and against not only the spirit of the law, but more importantly, against the way the law was written. And you definitely don't have the authority to do that. So I think it'll make the appellate court's job very easy, but I don't think they needed that anyway. The bigger issue is, how do you enforce a judge's ruling against an administration and against a department like HHS when they're just choosing to ignore it? Now, you and I ignore a judge and we find ourselves a guest of the state or the federal government in a nice little room that had bars on it. Mm-hmm. Or, as they say, if you ignore a ruling by a federal judge around the IRS, they come take your stuff. Well, that really doesn't work when you're dealing with the federal government. When you've got Secretary Becerra, who basically said, hey, I understand your ruling and I'm going to choose to ignore it. His words were, or the response was, enforcement discretion, which I find an interesting term, that somebody thinks they can choose to enforce some laws and not others. But then it begs the question, so what? What does the judge do? Does he haul Becerra in front of him and throw him in jail for contempt of court? I think theoretically he could do that. He's not going to. No one's ever done something like that. So NSA, I don't think, is going to get fully implemented correctly until more things happen, like some of their lawsuits or a private course of action against the payers or a change in administration or something else, because clearly the judge made a very specific ruling and the government's just choosing to ignore it. And the Chevron case isn't going to change that. Like I said, it's going to make the appellate court's job easier, but it doesn't really give any more enforcement teeth to Judge Kernodle than he already had.
Well, and let's remember, too, who Javier Becerra is. He was the former Attorney General of California, and as an Attorney General, you do have some sort of discretion, particularly in your state. I think Judge Kernodle and other reasonable people might argue that when you're in charge of enforcing federal law and you're the Secretary of Health and Human Services, you don't necessarily have that discretion like he's suggested here. It seems like with the Chevron case being overturned, a lot of the hope is that all of a sudden it's going to force the government to do stuff. And as you just pointed out, and as I think you put it best in an internal meeting this morning, the question you got to ask is, well, who's the policeman, and is the policeman going to do anything? And the policeman here is Becerra, and it's obvious he's not doing anything with this.
Yeah, and that really gets to the crux of the issue. How do you enforce something? Who's the police officer here? And when the cop wants to take the year off and not write traffic tickets, do you really have a traffic law? And this is sort of an interesting, when I was in college, I had a class and we all went on a field trip to an actual courtroom, and it was a federal case. And the case, and the judge knew we were coming, which was really great because after the case, he stopped and talked to us and explained what he did. And the case involved a man who was suing the federal government because he received injuries by being part of a civil rights march. And his bus was attacked by members of the KKK, and he was beaten and paralyzed. And he was suing the federal government because he found out much later, or he believes, that the FBI had an informant inside the KKK and didn't stop the attack, didn't participate in it, but didn't stop it because they didn't want to burn the informant. And so he was basically saying the federal government should have stopped this attack and was suing the federal government. Okay. So a representative from the FBI gets on the stand and plaintiff's attorney is asking him, did you have an informant? Asking him this question. And he's saying, I'm refusing to answer. And he wouldn't answer the questions. He said, that's confidential and we will not answer that question. And so the judge paused the trial. He dismissed the jury. And then rather than go back to chambers, and he said, I have a classroom here and I want them to hear this exchange. The jury's not here. They can't hear it. And so he said to the FBI representative, you do understand that you don't have that right in this courtroom to refuse to answer a question when I tell you to answer it. And he said, yes, sir, I do. And he said, you understand, as a federal judge, I have the right to throw you in jail for contempt of court until such time as you'll comply. And he said, yes, sir, we will not comply. He said, you understand that theoretically, I could start calling your bosses in and doing the same thing until somebody answers the question. And theoretically, I can have the president of the United States sitting here and I can throw him in jail for contempt of court. He said, yes, Your Honor. He goes, are you going to answer the question? He said, no, Your Honor, we are not. And he said, okay, fine. He brings the jury back in. And we thought, this is going to be interesting. And he instructs the jury, okay, from now on, everything the plaintiff's attorney says is true and factual. You do not need any proof. And the defense is no longer allowed to speak in my courtroom. They cannot object. They cannot question. They can do nothing but listen. And he said, the reason for this is the defense has decided not to answer certain questions they legally are bound to. So they've given up their right to speak in this courtroom, and everything the plaintiff says is true and factual. It needs no more proof. Okay. And we thought, wow, what's going on here? Well, basically what the judge did was he won the case for the individual, because then all I had to say is they had somebody there. They could have stopped the beating. My client was injured. They owe us millions of dollars. And they won, and he won the judgment. And so after the case was over, we were talking to the judge, and he said, look, what I'm here is to produce justice. I can't be throwing people in jail. They're not going to answer the question. And they don't mind paying the money. So I got the guy the money. I gave the FBI a way to gracefully leave the room without admitting that they had somebody who could have stopped the attack. Justice was served. And I did it in such a way that everybody's okay. He goes, clearly, if the FBI wants to appeal this, this ruling will get tossed on appeal. I can't tell people to shut up in my courtroom. I don't have that ability, but they're not going to appeal it. And I thought, what an interesting way. He figured out a way to provide justice. Now, it brings out the idea. He realized he couldn't force the FBI to do anything they didn't want to do. So he found a way around it. I think Judge Conoto has realized he can't force Becerra to do this, but what he hasn't figured out a way, is there a way to serve justice here? I think he partly did that by opening the door when CMS said, well, we trust the payers are doing this correctly. That leaves the payers, I think, open for a private course of action. I hope somebody eventually sues them, because if the payers are found guilty and have to pay billions of dollars, that will fix it. Yeah. But until that happens, we're stuck in this, catch-22 or this standoff of, well, I'm not going to do it. Well, you have to do it. Well, I'm not going to do it. And how do you break that?
Right. Remind me as well, we've got a couple dates coming up in this latter half of the year regarding the No Surprises Act and the end of a supposed grace period regarding certain actions by the payers going into the IDR process. Can you bring me up to speed on that?
Yeah, so the next date is November. Now, you might be saying, November, what else is happening in November? That's right, there's an election in November. Those two things are not coincidental. Okay. The date of November that's the date by which CMS right now is guaranteeing their enforcement discretion. Okay. Now, they can push that date back again. They didn't say that at absolutely hard drop dead date, but they just guaranteed that even if the payers are doing it wrong, they're not going to enforce anything. They're not going to do any audits. They're not going to do any penalties until November. Now, I think that's highly tied to whatever happens in the election. Okay. So let's play out those two scenarios. Let's say Biden wins re-election. And Becerra knows I'm secretary of HHS a little bit longer. I think he'll extend that date. Okay. Let's say Trump wins the election. What do I care if I'm Becerra? I'm out anyway. I got a couple more. I got Thanksgiving and Christmas, and then I'm out the door. And so I don't think he does anything after that. And then he'll hand it off to whoever warms that seat after him. So November's right now the next date, but I wouldn't put too much stock in that. Nothing's going to change. That November is just tied to whether they have got to extend, because Becerra is still going to be in that chair, or if you can go, ask the next guy. I'm packing up. So that's the next big date.
And of course, to quote Jon Stewart earlier this week, the time between now and November is a lifetime. So something could change between now and then, either in the courts, I suppose, or any other litigation that comes through. And of course, any possible congressional action, although given I stand by our comments earlier in the year that the House doesn't know where the bathroom is and they can't agree on it. And I don't think anything's going to happen this year. But you did make another point this morning internally. I just want to bring up as we round out this discussion on Chevron and TMA3 that if in the event that we have another Biden administration, and in the event, say Democrats take control of Congress, or even Republicans take control of Congress, there's a possibility that we could see the No Surprises Act change to have a prescribed rate in IDR versus the QPA versus whatever data the providers provide. Tell me a little bit why you think that might be a possibility.
Yeah, so the payers are all very worried that this law will be implemented correctly. It will cost them a bunch of money, that it will do great things for hospital-based physicians. And so they're nervous about that. So they are definitely going to lobby for an amendment to the law, in addition to the law, for a prescribed rate. California has that in their state law. And basically it's hey, there can be this process, this dispute process, but it can never pay more than X. That's the prescribed rate. It'll create a maximum payment. And let's say they say the maximum payment should be 1.5 times Medicare. I'm just picking a number. Mm-hmm. Now, the thing to understand is No Surprises Act was passed with a bipartisan support. It's one of the few laws in the last several years that has had bipartisan support. So it had both. It had sponsors and support from both Republicans and Democrats. Now, it was pitched to each of them for a different reason. But one of the main things that helped it get passed was that it would save the federal government money. It would save them money by getting rid of all these exorbitant payments to these non-contracted hospital-based physicians. Their words, not mine. And it would save the government money as an employer, and it would reduce the subsidies under the Affordable Care Act. So it was pitched as, look, you'll save a bunch of money. And the instant you pass this, the 10-year budget deficit projection will go down. Okay. Which right now, if you can get a congressman to get on something that saves money where it isn't like cutting Social Security or cutting spending, it didn't have anything direct other than cutting reimbursement to physicians. It's a little bit like that scene from the movie Ghostbusters, when they're talking to the mayor of New York and they're going, Lenny, just think, if this works, you will have saved the lives of millions of registered voters. And his eyes light up. Only there it was, Representative, just think, this will save billions of dollars in deficit and you'll be able to run on that. Okay, so both sides liked it. Well, it hasn't turned out to be that beneficial financially. One, because the initial analysis was garbage. And two, because providers are winning the vast majority of these disputes in IDR. So their next pitch is going to be, hey, we've got to fix that loophole. So the way we can fix it is we just put this prescribed rate in and you will have just saved the government billions of dollars. Now, let's picture that, summer of next year. New Congress been seated. I don't care who's in control. It's summer of next year. Everybody in the House of Representatives run every 2 years, which means about the day after you get in your new office, you start campaigning for reelection. And somebody comes to your door and go, look, I can give you this golden opportunity to be able to run on the fact that you're saving the government a bunch of money. And boy, midterms are going to be rough for you. It's a fairly easy pitch to make, and that's what the payers are going to push. To be honest, to me, that is much more concerning than how long it's going to take NSA to fully be implemented correctly, because even though they're not doing it correctly, because the providers are winning the vast majority of the dispute cases, they're doing okay. Not great, but okay. But once you put a prescribed rate in, game over. Okay, then it's it. It doesn't matter what you can say to the arbiter. There will be this maximum rate you can pay, and that'll be a problem. Now, to circle back to Chevron, that could come all the way back to Chevron. Where that has to be very explicit, who has the authority to implement it, all that stuff. So it gets really messy.
Well, and if any of that starts to come down the pike as we're paying attention, we'll talk about it right here on the Flatlining Podcast. Ron, thanks for sitting down with me this afternoon. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
This is an episode of the Flatlining Podcast. Well, now you can read a recap. Just go to flatlining.net and look right there on the homepage every Monday. for a written recap on last week's episode.